Good evening, everyone. Today we're going to be doing Parashat VaYechi, the closing section in the book of Bereshit. And I would like to bring, for those of you who have my source sheet, I would like to look at two sources about our kind of introduction to the shiur. And for people who've heard my podcast, you probably heard me refer to this, and there may be some overlap, but I am sure you will hear something new this evening. So let's begin with the first reference, which is a quote from Bereshit, Genesis, chapter 5, verse 1. And it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. On the day that God created Adam, in the likeness of God, did he create him." And there's a very interesting rabbinic commentary, which appears in the Jerusalem Talmud, Nidarim, chapter 9, halacha 4, which says the following. It was taught in a Braita. Rabbi Akiva said, "And you should love your fellow as yourself." This is a major principle of the Torah. Ben Azai said, "This is the book of Adam," is an even greater principle. So I'm sure everybody is familiar with the first part of the statement, Rabbi Akiva, who says, the Ahavta l'reacha kamocha, this is a major principle of the Torah. And in many circles, right, this is the essence of Judaism, right? How you relate to other people, interpersonal relations. But usually the second statement gets lost. Ben Azai, who says this is the book of Adam, is in fact a much greater principle. Now, I just want to say that the pshat, the simple reading of the verse, when it says this is the book of the generations of Adam, or without being sexist, of man, or maybe I should say humanity. Essentially, chapter 5 is outlining the genealogy from Adam to Noah, but from the perspective of the Torah, it's really outlining history, world history, which from the Torah begins with Adam, so that when we talk about the book of Toldot Adam, the book is essentially history, the book of history, the whole transmission from generation to generation. But I don't think that that's what Ben Azai is actually referring to. And I'm not the only one who says this. This actually appears in a major halachic work on the laws of mourning called Gesher HaChayim, which is written by a Jerusalem rabbi who passed away about 65 years ago. His name was Rav Michal Tikuchinsky. And he says, Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam essentially is not the book of humanity, but it's actually referring to the book that each person writes. And the question is, how much do we think about this? That each one of our lives is really a book. Every day, a new page in that book. You might say every phase of our life is a new chapter in that book. And it raises a very interesting question. What does our book look like? And maybe this is perhaps the most fundamental principle of the Torah. How much do we think about the book that we're writing? Who are we? What have we done with our lives? I'm going to leave this for one moment and now come to the next quote. which is also a fascinating quote. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, Bava Metzia 87a. And it says the following. And by the way, for those of you who have my source sheet, so this is taken from Sepharia. So whatever is in bold print is a literal translation of the text of the Talmud. Whatever's not in bold print is the translator's commentary or addition. So let's see what it says. And I'll read this in the English. Until Abraham's time, there was no concept of aging. One who wanted to speak to Abraham would speak to Isaac. One who wanted to speak to Isaac or would speak to Abraham. And Abraham came and prayed for mercy, and aging came about. As it is stated, and Abraham was old, well stricken in age. Okay, I don't like that translation. Okay, in the Hebrew, it's Abraham was old, coming in days, which actually is better. Now let's look at the second thing. Until the time of Jacob, there was no illness, and here I'm going to take the commentary, no illness that preceded one's death. And as it says in the commentary, rather one would die suddenly. And then Jacob came and he prayed for mercy. And all of a sudden, illness was brought into the world. And here, this is the commentary, allowing one to prepare for his death. As it is stated, and one said to Joseph, behold, your father is sick. Okay? So what are these two statements that we have in the Talmud? The first one is saying that until the time of Abraham, there was no concept of aging. And which today is fascinating because there are so many people who, when they start getting old, don't want to look old, don't want to feel old. You do everything to try to maintain, okay, your youth. And I even joke around with people and say that, the classic line is, may you live to 120. So I say to people, no, my bracha to you is, may you live to 100 and be like someone who's 20. So even I kind of fall into that trap of who wants to be old, right? We all want to be young. And so it's kind of counterintuitive that here is Abraham who's really praying that people should age. Now, I also want to point out, it's interesting that the verse which they quote is from Genesis chapter 24:1. And for those of you who are skeptics, you can check it out, right, in your Tanakh, and you'll see it really appears. But for those of you who want, you can actually check out an earlier verse, which is in Genesis chapter 18, verse 11, Parashat VaYechi, which is actually the first time where it speaks about aging. And in fact, over there, it says that both Abraham and Sarah were old, coming in days, and Sarah had stopped having essentially her menstrual cycle. The way that it's phrased in the Torah is the way of women. And so, in fact, it's really interesting that the first time that it appears is a kind of prelude to when Sarah is told about the impending birth of Isaac. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because it's very interesting, because the way that the Talmud phrases it is that the reason why Abraham prayed for aging was so that people will be able to differentiate between him and Isaac. Because he looked just like his son, or you could say the exact opposite. And so Abraham felt it was extremely important that we should be able to make this generational separation. Now, in order to say that, you have to quote the verse from chapter 24, because Isaac was not around in chapter 18. But if in fact, the verse which is the first time that the Torah speaks of anybody being old is in chapter 18, then maybe actually the Torah, and here I will respectfully differ with the explanation which is given in the Talmud, which is that maybe in fact, Abraham did pray for aging, and is the first one who's referred to as being old. But maybe it was in order to be able to somehow appreciate this movement from one stage of life to the next stage of life. And in fact, it might very well be that this might be what separates Parashat Lech Lecha from Parashat VaYera, that in Parashat Lech Lecha we have the description of Abraham's journey, so to speak, which ultimately culminates in two covenants which he makes with God. And then VaYera is now the next stage. And in this next stage, Abraham is described as now being old. And again, I'll come back to this in a few moments. But I want to now go to the second statement, which is really going to be the essential, how should I put it, springboard for the shir tonight, which is that Yaakov prayed for illness. And if I take the simple reading of the Talmud, which would fit in with the verses, in our parsha, it's the first time that we find that anybody is described as being sick, which means that in fact, no one was actually sick until this time. Now, the way the commentary is explaining it, which also fits in with the verses, is that perhaps people were sick, but you never had a situation of people who would be sick and then, as a result of that, die. And I'll just say parenthetically, there is a rabbinic comment which appears somewhere else that says that in fact the way that people would die would be that they would sneeze. And when they would sneeze, then their soul would depart. And it's as if, in other words, how are people created? When God breathed in Adam the breath of life through his nostrils, well, how does your life depart? When the breath of life goes out of your nostrils. And there are various people who want to say that this is actually the reason why when people sneeze today, and not just today, but for many, many years, that you say to them, Gesundheit, or in Hebrew, you'd say labriyut, to your health. Or some people might say, God bless you, as a way of saying that may this sneezing not be a curse, right? And your end, okay? But my topic tonight is not about sneezing. My topic tonight is essentially about what Yaakov does in this week's parsha. And let me refer to something which I've spoken about in previous podcasts. It's fascinating that there are two parshiot in the Torah that focus on the death of an individual. Parshat Chayei Sarah, which begins with the death and the burial of Sarah, and our parsha, which essentially focuses on the death of Jacob. And it's fascinating that both of those parshiot actually are titled Life. The life of Sarah and Parshat VaYechi, and Jacob lived. And it's true, people can say, well, it's because that's the opening word, and the rabbis always, but there's much more to it than that. And it really has to do with the Jewish perception of death. And generally we see, when we speak about death, we see death as being the interruption of life. Death being something which is extremely tragic. But maybe you could also see death as being the culmination of life. And if in fact I go back to the first reference which I began with, if death is the culmination of life, it's essentially the closing lines of my book. And therefore, if I now come back to this statement in the Talmud about Jacob prayed that he should be ill before he died. So I think the way that the commentary, right, Safaria, whoever wrote it, said to prepare himself for death, right, which maybe he meant to say, to get himself ready so that, but I want to take that in a certain direction, which is that the way that Jacob wanted to get himself ready for his death was essentially to bring a closure to his life. And that's what I want to focus on tonight. How Jacob ties together a number of different elements in this parsha, so that in fact, when Jacob dies, he has actually put the final strokes on his book. He has, in a certain sense, orchestrated his death. He has seen to it that, yes, he has a very clear ending for his book. And that's what I want to see tonight. And what we will be looking at are a number of different verses from the Torah, many of which appear in Parashat Chayei Sarah, because there are many parallels between these two parshiot that in fact show that what began in Parashat Chayei Sarah comes to its conclusion in this week's parsha. But before I get to Jacob, so let me go back a step when I was speaking about aging. And this is reference number 3, right? We said that Abraham is the first one who's described as being old. And the Talmud brought the verse from chapter 24, verse 1. By the way, this is Parshat Chayei Sarah. So I just want you to see that there is a logic, right? There is a method to my madness. So it says the following, if you can follow me. Chapter 24, verse 1. And Abraham was old, coming in days, and God had blessed him with everything. Then Abraham calls his servant, the elder of his house, tells him, put your hand below my thigh, and I want you to take an oath. This is verse 3. In the name of God, right? The God of heaven, the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose midst I dwell, but rather you will go to my land, to my birthplace, and take a wife for my son. So, what do I want to point out with this verse? Here is Abraham who's old. And I mentioned to you before that maybe Abraham prayed for becoming old as a way of God indicating to him that he's now entering a new stage of life. And I think if I look at these verses where it really highlights this, and even if I go back to chapter 18, which I said to you is the first time that it appears, what is the significance of Abraham becoming old? And I think to a great extent, When Abraham becomes old, it's the fact that at a certain point, Abraham has been so preoccupied with his own life, with what we could call his self-fulfillment, actualization, then now he's entering a new phase, which is to think about the next generation. So it's not coincidental that in chapter 18, the first time we mention about Abraham and Sarah being old, it's a prelude to the birth of Isaac. Because when they become old, this is now setting the stage for the new phase in their life. Up to now, they had no children. Now they have a child. Now everything becomes focused on that child becoming the heir, becoming the continuity of everything which they have created. And in chapter 24, after Sarah dies, from Abraham's perspective, his mission is to see that Isaac has a wife, and through that wife builds a home, builds a family, so that again, everything which Abraham has created will then be perpetuated in the next generation. Now, I want to point out that when we speak about Abraham getting old over here, okay, it's not clear how old was Abraham at that point, but it's fair to say that if you go by at least one rabbinic comment, or if you go, I should say by the verses, I shouldn't say rabbinic comment, based on the verses, right? Isaac gets married when he's 140. So it could very well be that this is happening when we don't know how much time elapsed, but when Isaac is certainly somewhere, when Abraham is somewhere between 139 and 140, he actually lived to be another 35 years. Okay, but the point which I want to make is he's getting old, not immediately before he dies. Now I want to show you a second verse, reference number 4 by Isaac, which you're all familiar with. This is from chapter 27, where it says, and when Isaac was old and his eyes are dimmed from seeing, chapter 27, verse 1, and he calls Esav his older son, and he says to him, my son, and he says, I am here, father. And then in verse 2, he says, behold, I have become old. I don't know when I'm going to die. And then, as we know in the continuation, he essentially says to Esav, I want you to go out, hunt some venison, make me a meal so that I should bless you before I die. So here I want you to see that with Isaac, there's already a kind of progression, that it's not just that Isaac is old, but Isaac is somehow anticipating the possibility that he might die at any given point. And here is Isaac, who, in the footsteps of Abraham, is also now thinking about what's going to be in the next generation. And as a result, what he wants to do is to now bless his son, okay, and perhaps set him on his destiny. So I want you to see that once again, getting old, okay, is creating that consciousness of, I've lived my life, but now I have to start thinking about what's going to be subsequently in terms of the next generation. How will my life's work be perpetuated? And over here, what we see is that getting old is also being connected with a certain consciousness, concern that I may die at any moment. So maybe I need to be doing something. So that when I then come to the next reference, number 5, which is our parsha, which starts out in chapter 47, verse 28, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, and the days of Jacob's life, right, the years of his life, are 147. And then what I've highlighted in verse 29, And Jacob's day, that was a Freudian slip, Israel's days are now approaching his death. Okay, so what you see is, here he is on the cusp. So we don't describe him anymore as being old. Okay, rather what we do is we say he is now nearing death. And then if I skip for a moment to chapter 48, verse 1, after these things, and Joseph is told, behold, your father is sick, which is the reference that appears in the Babylonian Talmud in Baba Metzia. So that here we see it's not just when we say his days are nearing his death, but now he's sick, which means it's imminent. So that here, everything in our parsha is not just that Jacob is old. I would even venture to say Jacob has been old for quite a while. In fact, you can see that from a verse when he speaks to Pharaoh, when he first meets him. Okay, that he says to Pharaoh, okay, that behold, I am. In fact, I have this a little bit. I have this. Wait, let me see. Do I have this on my sheet? Okay, I don't see it on my sheet. But when he first appears before Pharaoh, he tells him that. No, I actually do have it on my sheet. He tells him, if you look at number 6. This is chapter 47, verse 8 and 9. When Joseph brings him before Pharaoh, Pharaoh asks him, how old are you? Right? Or he says literally, how much of the days of your life? And that's a really strange question. The first thing that you say to somebody when you see, how old are you? And so there are quite a few commentaries who say, because Jacob looks unusually old, even though it doesn't say it in the text. And then you find how Jacob is explaining to him, right, how old he is. But he explains to him essentially he's doing what's classically Jewish, fetching, telling him, in other words, that my life has really not been so great, and it certainly didn't reach the days of my father, which is true. I mean, Jacob only lived to be 147, right? Yitzhak lived to be 180, Abraham 175. Okay, but I just want you to see, so already there, right, when Jacob first came down to Egypt, certainly according to many commentaries, he looks old. But our parsha, it's not he's old. He's like on the cusp of dying. And he's sick. And this is what creates the impetus for Jacob to now have to start putting together all the pieces, tie together all the loose ends. And as I said, to now create a closure to his life. So in the time that remains, what I'd like to do is to look at what are the things that Jacob does, excuse me, to create a closure to his life, and essentially the legacy which he is handing down to the next generation. So let's look at reference number 7. And now these are the opening verses in our parsha, which we've already seen, but I want to now look at it from another angle. 47, verse 29, it says, in the days of Israel are approaching his death, and he calls Joseph. And if we look at verse 29, he says, lo, if it is found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh. He makes him take an oath. Right? For those of you who are paying attention, that expression appears in Parshat Chayei Sarah, when Abraham was old, and he calls in his servant, and he makes him take an oath. And if you remember, in that section, the oath was, make sure that my son does not marry a Canaanite. And what's the oath over here? Al na tikbareni b'Mitzrayim. Don't bury me in Egypt. And then he says in verse 30, V'shachavti avotai, I want to sleep with my fathers. Unesatani mimitzrayim, lift me up from Egypt. Ukfartani b'kfuratam, bury me in their burial spot. And then Joseph says, I will do as you ask. And by the way, I don't know why I left this out, but the very next verse, right, for those of you who have it, so let me just find this, is that essentially Joseph doesn't just say, I will do what you ask, but if you look at verse 31, it says, Jacob says, that's not good enough. Hishavali, swear to me. And Joseph swears to him. Okay? Maybe before I start looking at what's going on here with this oath, I want to point out something else, which I think is really very important. Okay, and that is, at a certain point in Jacob's life, and this is essentially when he has his encounter with Esav, there is this kind of struggle, this dialectic, what you might say, even identity crisis. Who is he? And what do I mean by that? When he was born, he's Jacob. But then when he encounters his brother, okay, he wrestles with this guy, and then he calls him Israel, and then subsequently, in the aftermath of what happens in Shechem, when Shimon and Levi destroy Shechem, God affirms that and says, you are now to be called Israel. But when God affirms this, it's not in the same way when God changed Abraham's name. When God changed Abraham's name in chapter 17, he said to him, you will no longer be Avram. You from now on will be Avraham. And from that point on, he is always referred to as Avraham. When Jacob takes on the identity of Israel, he doesn't leave behind the identity of Jacob, but he's always struggling between these two identities. And what's the difference between Jacob and Israel? So I've spoken about this in other settings. I'll just summarize briefly. Jacob is the one who's coming from behind. Jacob is the one who's always struggling to survive. Jacob is always the one who's somehow, I would say, passive. Israel is the one who actually struggles. Israel is the one who triumphs. And so it's always interesting to see what's his name. And I want to say that in our parsha, the name that's really the central name is Israel. And that's why it says, when it begins by saying, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. Yes, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt. Jacob is surviving in the land of Egypt. But what happens now is he's taking on the persona of Israel, not just of the one who's surviving, but the one who's going to triumph, the one who's going to chart Jewish destiny. And what is it that he asks of Joseph? Do not bury me in Egypt. And this is a question which fathers many commentaries. Why is Jacob so insistent to not be buried in Egypt? And for those of you, and I didn't bring it here because I've discussed this in other podcasts, there's a very interesting Rashi here who gives a number of explanations. One of them is that Jacob is concerned that if he's going to be buried in Egypt, he will be worshipped. He will become part of the Egyptian pantheon, and he doesn't want to become an idol. Another one is that Jacob has prophecy. He sees that there will be the 10 plagues, and that one of the 10 plagues is lice. and the lice come up from the ground, and Jacob doesn't want to be infested with lice. And a third interpretation is this belief that the resurrection of the dead will be in the land of Israel. Well, what happens for those people, right, who are buried outside the land of Israel? So there are underground tunnels that you have to roll around through until you eventually come to the land of Israel and then pop up during the time of the resurrection of the dead. And although I can't see, the expression on many of the people here, but I'm assuming that everybody's probably chuckling at, a lot of these interpretations. In any case, I think the real reason why Jacob is insistent is because of what, if you look at reference 6, it's chapter 47, verse 27, the last verse in Parashat VaYigash. And maybe before I look at that last verse, let me show you a few other verses. If you go to chapter 47, this is still in reference 6, chapter 47, verse 4. When Joseph presents his brothers before Pharaoh, the brothers say to Pharaoh, Lagur ba'aretz banu, we have come to dwell in the land, because there is no grazing, there's no pasture for the sheep of your servants, because the famine is very heavy. And then what they say is, and now let us settle down in the land of Goshen. Now, in the Hebrew, the two words which I'm focusing on is lagur, lashevet. And in the nuance of the Hebrew, they have different meanings, and which is how I translated it. Lagur is to dwell. Lashevet is to settle. The difference between these two terms is between something which is temporary versus something which is permanent. The brothers say, we came down to Egypt now to dwell. Why? There's a famine. And now if I go a few psukim further, which is the last pasuk in reference 6. So anyway, if we go ahead to as I said, verse 27, which is the last verse of Parashat VaYigash, it says, VaYechi Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen, VaYe'achazuva. And Israel settles down in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. And I'll translate this, VaYe'achazuba. They are grabbed by the land. VaYifru vayirbu ma'od, and they are fruitful and multiplying, which means that the original intent of coming down to the land of Egypt was to just be there temporarily, to somehow wait out the famine, but with the idea being we'll then go back to the land of Israel. But what ends up happening is they settle in the land of Egypt. And I might even add they're very comfortable in the land of Egypt. And now let me go back to the opening verse I have in reference number 6. This is from chapter 37, verse 1. The opening sentence of Parashat VaYechi, right? The parsha that begins the whole story of Joseph and his brothers. It says, VaYeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. And Jacob is now settling down in the land of the sojourning, the dwelling of his father in the land of Canaan. Which means the opening verse of Parashat VaYeshev is saying that whereas Isaac was dwelling in the land of Israel, Jacob is now trying to settle down in the land of Israel. And now, if, as I said, look at the last verse in reference 6, which I read to you, things have now been flipped on its head. The same Jacob who tried to settle down in the land of Israel and to establish a permanent presence of his family in the land of Israel, all of a sudden finds that everything is flipped on its head. And Israel is settled. Who is Israel? Is Israel his children? Is Israel Jacob? They're settled where? In the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. And therefore, what I want to say is the reason why Jacob is so insistent on being buried and not being buried in the land of Egypt is to give a message to his children. The land of Egypt is not the land of our destiny. Ultimately, the land of Egypt is not the place where we are to settle down. And now, if I go a little bit further, if we look in reference 7, chapter 49, verse 29, after Jacob gives the blessings to his son, he then speaks to all of the children, and he says to them, VaYetzavotam, he commands them. He says, I am now being collected to my people. Bury me with my forefathers in the cave, which is in the field of Ephraim the Hittite. In the cave, which is in the field of Machpelah, which is in the area of Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham acquired the field from Ephraim the Hittite. And then he says, La'achuzat kaver, for a burial, achuzah. The word achuzah means something which is a landhold. And then he says in verse 31, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rivka, his wife. There I buried Leah. The acquisition in the field and the cave from the children of Chet. Now, because I see my time starting to run out, and this always happens to me, so I'll just tell you, if you go back to Parashat Chayei Sarah, chapter 23, when it actually speaks about the burial place, Machpelah, you'll see that a number of phrases which Jacob speaks about are central in chapter 23. And two things in particular, the acquisition of the field and this idea of achuzat kever. The idea of an achuzah, a landhold, is what appears later on when the Jewish people take possession of the land of Israel. Each tribe is given an achuzah. The first achuzah is the cave of Machpelah. It's the first acquisition of land, the foothold, what establishes the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. If I go back to that last verse in Parashat Vayigash, the Jews are not just settling in the land of Egypt. Vayechazu ba, they are grabbed by it. They see the land of Egypt as being their landhold. This is their destiny. So that Jacob, by insisting on not being buried in the land of Egypt, is telling his children, don't confuse the land of Egypt for the land of Israel. Don't think that you have now reached the promised land. No, no matter how long you'll be in Egypt, Egypt is never the place for you to settle. Egypt is never the place which is going to be your possession, your achuzah. The achuzah is in the land of Israel. And that's why it becomes so critical, because by him, it's not just where am I buried, but by him being buried in the land of Israel, he is now establishing the achuzah. And I will suggest an interpretation. The fact that he insists on mentioning that this is where Abraham and Sarah buried, this is where Isaac and Rebekah buried, this is where I buried Leah. If I now am going to be buried in this place, 3 couples are buried there. The matriarchs and the patriarchs, no one else will be buried there. But by those 3 couples being buried there, 3, the number 3 establishes a chazakah, something which is an established fact. The moment 3 couples are buried there, it's an established fact that the foundation of the Jewish people is connected to the land of Israel. And therefore, if Jacob will be buried in the land of Israel, this becomes the symbol to his children of them eventually taking possession of the land of Israel. So that the first point, which I want to show you in terms of this idea of closure, is what began in Parshat Chayei Sarah is now come to a closure in our parsha. If Sarah is the first one to be buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, and to begin the process of it becoming what's called an achuzah, a landhold, Jacob is the one who finalizes that. And when he is buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, Ma'arat HaMachpelah becomes an achuzat kever, but the significance of that is not just in establishing this burial plot. It's that the burial plot becomes a symbol of the life, of the possession of the Jewish people of the land of Israel. So this now leads me to my second point, which is reference number 8. The very next thing which we're told, and this is when Jacob now is ill and where his death is imminent, is where Joseph now brings to Jacob his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And you'll excuse me, but just because of the limited amount of time, so I will not actually look straight in the verses and read them, but you can check this afterwards, since I'm assuming people are familiar with the story. Joseph brings Ephraim and Manasseh, and Jacob then goes on to bless them. And as you all know in the story, Joseph places them so that Jacob's right hand will be on the firstborn Manasseh, and the other hand, the left, on Ephraim, the younger. And then Jacob switches his hands. And then when Joseph sees this, this is in reference 8, chapter 48, verse 17. 48:17. Joseph says to Jacob, "What are you doing?" And it even says it's evil in the eyes of Joseph. He picks up his father's hands, right? He tries to switch them, right? And Joseph says to him, "What are you doing?" Right? This is the firstborn. And Jacob responds to him in verse 19 and says, "I know, my son, I know, and he will be a nation, and he will be great, but the younger brother will be greater than him, and his children will inherit the fullness of nations. So, here is another closure on a number of levels. On a certain level, this is a corrective of what I read to you earlier. When Isaac is old and he wants to bless his sons, what does he do? He calls Esav and he tells him, go out and hunt and bring me some food and I'll give you a blessing. And then what happens is, we all know, Jacob masquerades as Esav, tricks his father, gets the blessing. And then when Esav appears on the scene, so Isaac then says, okay, I'll give you a different blessing. And then later on, right, before Jacob goes to find himself a wife, Isaac gives him a subsequent blessing. The fact that Isaac blesses his children and in effect is handing down his legacy to his children, the way that he does led to a tragic outcome. What Isaac should have done was to take both of his children and bless them together, and to perhaps express to them the role that he sees each one will be playing in the Jewish people. He doesn't do that. And by dividing them, he sets the stage for what eventually be a split between Jacob and Esav. And perhaps what's more tragic is that Esav leaves the fold. And this is something which always bothers me. A priori, Esav should have been part of that continuity of the Jewish people. He's born from Isaac and from Rebekah. He is Jewish. And yet somehow, because of this tragic failure, he was cut out of the Jewish people. Jacob's greatness is to be inclusive. And the way that he does it is, first, he brings together the two sons of Joseph. And although he gives the greater blessing to the younger son, by doing it this way, he preserves the unity of those two children and sets the stage for the unity of the Jewish people. Both of them will now become incorporated as part of the 12 tribes. And essentially what he's doing is making them, giving Joseph a double portion in the 12 tribes. But when he's incorporating them, he's highlighting that Ephraim will be the lead. So now I want to come to my next point, which is a follow-up to what I said earlier. I said to you, the first thing which Jacob does is to insist on being buried in the land of Israel and to establish Ma'arat HaMachpelah as the Achuzat Kever, as the foothold, the anchor, which is drawing the magnet that's drawing the Jewish people back. The next thing which he does is to establish the primacy of Ephraim. And I hope you all know the significance of Ephraim is Joshua. Joshua comes from the tribe of Ephraim. Joshua is ultimately the one who brings the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. Not only brings them back to the land of Israel, but sees to it that the Jewish people establish themselves in the land of Israel. He gives each tribe their portion, their achuzah, which means the next stage is to set in motion the one who will become instrumental to then bringing the Jewish people back and establishing their settlement of the land of Israel. And then the final thing which Jacob does after this is reference number 9, where Jacob calls all of his sons, gathers them together, and this is a significant part of the parsha, where he gives each of the sons a blessing. But again, I want to emphasize, each son is getting a blessing in the presence of all of the other sons. And as I discussed last year in Live with Rav Meir, when we looked at the blessings, each son is in effect being told, what is their role in the Jewish people? What is it that they have to contribute to Jewish peoplehood? So therefore, if you now see the progression of what's happening here, the first thing which Jacob brings to a closure is where he'll be buried. And essentially, to establish Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah, as the foothold of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, as their achuzah, but it's an achuzat kever. It's a burial plot. The next thing is to establish Ephraim as the prime son of Joseph. And here now, maybe I'll even say, as even the corrective of Joseph. Joseph is the one who brings his family down to Egypt. Joseph is the one who even establishes his family. Joseph played an instrumental role in that verse, which I keep on harping on, of settling them in the land of Goshen, of making them comfortable in the land of Goshen. The corrective is his descendant, Yoshua ben Nun, who's from the tribe of Ephraim, the next generation or a few generations down, who'll be the one who will then bring them back to the land of Israel, who will then establish them in the land of Israel, give them their achuzah, their possession of the land of Israel. And after the Jews have the possession of the land, the next stage is, and what's going to be the society they're going to form? What's the role that each tribe has in building that society? And those are the blessings that he gives to his 12 sons. So in effect, what Jacob has done in this parsha is to show his sons where their future is. And this is Jacob's crowning achievement. This is really where Jacob becomes Israel. The first line in the parsha, and Yaakov lived for 17 years. For those of you who have a sensitivity to the 17, Joseph in Parashat VaYechi is 17 years old, when all of a sudden all the problems start to come up, which means there's a certain closure over here. There were 17 years before the birth of from the birth of Joseph until Joseph becomes 17, when Jacob is flourishing on a personal level. His family is complete. He's becoming exceedingly wealthy. He's beginning, as it says in the beginning of Parashat VaYechi, to settle down in the land of Israel. And then all of a sudden that blows up. When Joseph has his dreams, the brothers try to kill him. He disappears. Jacob thinks he's dead. Jacob closes out his life in the land of Egypt. One could even say those might have been the most beautiful period of his life on a personal level. He has all of his children. They're living well. Joseph is extremely successful, right? You could even see it as being a corrective of all of those miserable years he spent with his father-in-law, Lavan, in the diaspora. He was struggling with his father-in-law. Now here he is getting nachas from his children and grandchildren in the land of Egypt. But all of that is on a personal level. Israel, which reflects the destiny of the Jewish people, is highlighting to his children, my personal life has come to its end. But I need to give you your legacy for the future. And that's essentially what Israel does in this parsha, as I tried to show you in 3 stages. And by doing that, he brings a closure to the book of Breshit. He brings a closure to the story of the patriarchs and matriarchs. He brings a closure to what began with Abraham when God said, Lech Lecha. He is now seeing to it that everything which began with Abraham in Lech Lecha, in the 2 covenants which God made with Abraham, in the birth of Isaac, all of that is now being handed down to his children to be the vision of their future. And this is his success. That what in fact he handed down to his children ultimately materializes. And maybe just to show you in the last verse, or the next to last verse of the parsha, which perhaps shows how he succeeded. Look at chapter 50. It's not on my sheet. Chapter 50, verse 24. And Joseph says to his brothers, Anochi met, I'm about to die. And God will surely remember you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then Joseph makes them take an oath. And he says to them, when God will surely remember you, bring up my bones from this place. Not bury me in Machpelah, because no, Machpelah has been closed with Jacob. But bury me back in the land of Israel. And this becomes the sign to the brothers. Ultimately, the place of the Jewish people is in the land of Israel. And for those of you who are familiar, at the end of the book of Joshua, we're told how Joseph, in fact, was buried in the area of Shem, so that Joseph's wishes were actualized. Here is Joseph, who understood the message of his father. And before he dies, he makes sure to remind everyone else, remember, Egypt is not the promised land. Remember that ultimately you are destined to go back to the land of Israel. So I would like to end by saying, maybe come back to how I began the shiur. I speak for myself because I feel that I certainly am at a point in my life where I have aged. And I am certainly at this point in my life very conscious of the idea of death, as you know, with the passing of my wife last year. And this is something which certainly resonates with me. And also I've thrown to the hopper. And I also retired from Pardes. So Teaching in Pardes for me was my life's work in many, many ways. And although I'm still teaching for Pardes, but I speak personally that, but at this stage in my life, I'm thinking much more about my children and grandchildren, and I hope great-grandchildren, to think about what is the legacy which I would like to leave them with. Okay, and the idea being I've lived my life, and I think I still have much more to live and much more to enjoy. But maybe now's the time to start thinking about the next generation and what is it that we're handing down. And as I said with Jacob, ultimately, what's the book which I want to write? What's going to be the closing chapter? Jacob merited something which I think very few people merit. And that is that to a great extent, he kind of orchestrated his death. I mean, just to show you this one verse, which at the end of reference 9, in verse 33, it says, and when Jacob finished commanding his children, and by the way, the word command is the word today for tzava'ah, which is a will, right? Which we could understand as, what am I handing down to the next generation? He gathers in his legs to the bed. He expires and he's gathered unto his people. It's as if Jacob, after he blesses his children, after he's tied together all the loose ends, he's now able to peacefully say, I've done what I need to do, and to expire. Very few people can actually just bring their life to a conclusion and to just lie down and expire. By the way, it's a little bit eerie, but for those of you who have access to this book, which I mentioned earlier, Gesher HaChayim, his son wrote an English translation of one section of the book, which actually is trying to give a perspective, a Jewish perspective on life and death, and I made reference to it. But what's fascinating is in the introduction to the book, he describes how this rabbi died. And he essentially says what I'm just saying now about Jacob, how this rabbi was putting the final touches on his book. And he was very, very ill towards the end. He was in the hospital, put the final touches on his book, gave it over to his children. And then his children were present at a certain point. He blessed all of them. And then he just he actually said the vidui, the confession. He actually describes how, like, there's a whole process of somebody who's in the throes of death, like, what should you say? What do you do? And then what he just did was he brought his hands together and he expired. And the way the son describes it is, and we didn't feel like he died. It was in fact at that moment that they felt that they had a kind of divine revelation. They felt like the presence of God was at the moment of his death. Now, I tend to be somebody who relates to various stories and is not so skeptical. And I wish myself, and I wish all of us, that we should be able to perhaps have that type of death, where at the time that we die, we can feel that we've actually brought a conclusion to our lives and that we're now ready to go. So although we've spoken a lot about death and aging, I hope that this hasn't been depressing, but rather I hope that it's been a little bit uplifting to perhaps give us a positive spin on what it means to age and what it means to prepare yourself for death. And that in that sense, I think that Jacob, Israel, can be a very, very important model for us. Shabbat Shalom to everyone.